Hey everyone, welcome to Dr. Sleep. We love creating unique content for you, but we need your support now more than ever. Our channel is facing some challenges, and we really need your interaction. If you enjoy what we offer, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share our videos with your friends. Every comment, like, and share makes a huge difference. Let's grow together and keep bringing you the content you care about. Thank you for your continued support. Ethan had never been this desperate. He'd burned through his last paycheck months ago, his car payment was overdue, and his landlord had left a voicemail that carried the weight of an impending eviction. When his friend Derek mentioned a fire lookout job, easy work, good pay, total isolation, it seemed too good to be true. And maybe it was. The Briar Rock Fire Lookout Tower sat deep in the mountains, miles from civilization. A rusted metal staircase spiraled up into the canopy, leading to a small, weather-beaten cabin perched above the treetops. Ethan met Supervisor Graves at the base of the tower. The man was gaunt, his ranger uniform hanging loose, his face carved by sleepless nights. He handed Ethan a tattered notebook, its pages yellowed with age. "Read this," Graves said, voice hollow. "Follow every rule. If you don't, you won't last." Ethan flipped it open, the words scrawled in uneven, frantic handwriting. "Rules for the Briar Rock Fire, Lookout 1. Never acknowledge the man on the radio. Every night at exactly 2:13 a.m., the radio will crackle with static, and a man will start whispering your name. No matter what he says, do not respond. 2. If you see fire outside but smell nothing, it isn't real. Sometimes you'll see flames in the distance, but if you don't smell smoke, it's not really there. Do not report it, do not look at it for too long, and do not leave the tower to investigate. 3. Lock the cabin door before midnight every night. At 11:59 p.m., you must lock the cabin door and check it twice. If you hear knocking afterward, do not answer. If the knocking stops and you hear your own voice begging to be let in, turn off the lights and hide. 4. The forest doesn't always stay the same. The tree line may shift. Trails that existed yesterday may not be there tomorrow. If you ever notice a path leading toward your tower that wasn't there before, do not follow it. Close the blinds and wait until sunrise. 5. Don't look directly at the watcher on the ridge. At dusk, you may notice a silhouette standing on the far ridge, motionless, watching the tower. If you look directly at it, it will take a step closer. Blink too many times and it will reach the base of your tower. 6. The fire tower is taller than it looks. Don't look down at night. If you lean over the railing after dark, the ground might seem too far away. Some rangers claim to see something moving down there, reaching upward. If you hear it whisper your name, go inside immediately. 7. If someone claims to be your supervisor but has no face, lock the door. A man in a ranger's uniform may appear at the tower claiming to be your supervisor. If his face is blurred, he isn't real. Do not speak to him. Do not let him in. Do not listen when he starts calling for help. 8. The logbook writes back. Never ask it questions. Inside the cabin, there's a logbook to record fire activity. If you write something and find an answer written beneath it the next day, ignore it. If it asks a question, do not answer. 9. If you wake up outside, run back to the tower without looking behind you. Sometimes, you may wake up standing outside the fire tower with no memory of how you got there. Do not question it. Do not look behind you. Do not check the time. Just run. 10. If a second you walks into the tower, you have 10 seconds to kill it. One night, you may hear footsteps coming up the stairs, and then you will walk in. It will smile. It will say everything is fine. If it reaches the desk, it will sit down. If it sits down, you are dead. Kill it before it kills you. Ethan looked up, swallowing hard. Was this some kind of joke? Graves just stared at him. Do your job, follow the rules, and don't listen when they call your name. Then he turned and walked into the forest. That night at exactly 2:13 a.m., the radio crackled. Ethan sat at the old wooden desk, staring at the dusty radio bolted into the wall. It was an antique thing, all knobs and static, the kind that should have been retired decades ago. The clock on the desk read 2:12 a.m. His hands curled into fists as he waited, the rule book open in front of him. Rule number 1 repeated in his head like a mantra. Never acknowledge the man on the radio. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the radio crackled. It was subtle at first, just a faint hiss of static, like an old vinyl record spinning in a dead room. But then, a voice, low, soft, knowing. Ethan. He flinched. The voice was closer than he expected, as if someone stood inches away from the receiver, lips brushing the microphone. Ethan, talk to me. Ethan swallowed hard. Ignore it, don't respond. You're alone out here, aren't you? The voice murmured. No one to talk to, no one to help. The static ebbed and flowed, and Ethan felt his stomach churn. There was something wrong about the voice. It wasn't monotone, but it lacked normal human rhythm. It was too precise, too careful, each syllable deliberate. I know why you took this job, the voice continued. You needed an escape, needed to disappear. His breath hitched. That's why she left, isn't it? Ethan's skin went cold. It knew about Olivia. She got tired of your failures, the voice whispered. Tired of waiting for you to be better. You couldn't keep a job, Ethan. You couldn't keep her. The thing on the other end of the radio chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. I bet you'd give anything to hear her voice again. His hands shook over the radio's controls. The urge to grab the microphone, to scream at it, to tell it to shut up, burned in his chest. But his eyes locked onto the rule book, that first rule staring back at him. Never acknowledge the man on the radio. Ethan gritted his teeth, forced his hands away. The voice hummed as if considering. Smart, it murmured. Most don't last their first night. Then with a final hiss of static, it was gone. Silence flooded the cabin. Ethan sat frozen, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. It took nearly an hour before he could move again, and even then, his hands still trembled. At dawn, when he finally stumbled toward the desk, his breath caught. A scrap of burned paper lay beside the radio. 3 words scrawled in blackened ink. Let's talk soon. Ethan barely slept after the radio incident. Every noise outside the cabin sent a fresh jolt of panic through him, branches scraping against the tower, the wind howling through the rafters. He had read the rules 100 times over by now, but they didn't feel like guidelines anymore. They felt like warnings. By sunset, he was exhausted, but the sky was clear, the air crisp. And for a few minutes he allowed himself to believe that maybe this job wouldn't be as terrifying as it seemed. Then he saw the fire. It was in the distance, just beyond the ridgeline, a pillar of orange flames licking into the sky, rolling like a living thing through the dry trees. A forest fire. Ethan jolted forward, reaching for the radio. This is my job. I have to report this. But as his fingers brushed the microphone, something stopped him. The smell. Or rather the lack of it. No smoke, no burning pine, no acrid sting in the air. The rule came screaming back into his mind. 2. If you see fire outside but smell nothing, it isn't real. Ethan's breath quickened. The flame spread unnaturally fast, jumping from tree to tree as if chasing something unseen. But there was no ash, no embers floating through the sky. Then something moved in the fire. A figure stood in the flames. Tall, wrong, its limbs too long, too thin. It wasn't being burned. It wasn't even standing on the ground anymore. It was walking toward him. The flames did not spread in its wake. They followed it, clinging to its form like an extension of its body. Ethan staggered back, heart pounding against his ribs. His instinct screamed at him to run, to shut the blinds, to hide, but some dark, morbid curiosity kept his feet rooted. Then the thing stopped. It stood at the tree line, facing the tower, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The fire still roared around it, but the heat never reached Ethan's skin. It raised one hand and waved. Ethan's knees nearly buckled. The thing stood there, waiting, watching. Then, in a single horrifying instant, the fire vanished. not extinguished, not fading, but simply gone, as if someone had erased it from existence. The figure remained, standing in the smoldering darkness. Ethan lunged for the blinds and yanked them shut, breath coming in gasps. When he finally peeked outside again, it was gone. But the trees were different now. The forest had moved. Ethan sat on the floor of the fire tower, back against the wall, hands clenched so tightly his knuckles were bone white. His mind raced. The fire wasn't real. But something was. The forest had shifted. He didn't know how much, but it was closer. He could feel it, an unnatural pressure, like unseen eyes pressing against the cabin's thin walls. The sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness swallowed the land in an instant. Ethan forced himself to move, legs stiff as he got to his feet. His watch read 11:58 p.m. The rulebook sat on the desk, open to Rule #3. Lock the cabin door before midnight, every night. He swallowed hard and checked the deadbolt. Secure. He grabbed the handle. Locked. He checked again. Still locked. A long breath shuddered out of him. He turned, rubbing his face with shaking hands. Then, knock. Ethan's body went rigid. It was slow, deliberate. 3 firm knocks against the door. He squeezed his eyes shut. No. Knock, knock, knock. His breath hitched. He grabbed the chair from the desk and wedged it under the handle. Then the knocking stopped. For a few seconds, silence stretched through the cabin, so heavy it made his ears ring. Then, his own voice spoke from the other side of the door. Ethan. His stomach flipped. The voice was identical to his own, but something was off, too hollow, too smooth. Ethan, open the door. His pulse slammed against his ribs. He backed away, heart hammering in his chest. The voice softened. Please, let me in. It knew the tone to use, the exact lilt of desperation to press into his ears like a needle under the skin. I'm so scared, Ethan, it whispered. I don't know how I got out here. His nails dug into his palms. It's not me. It's not me. It's not me. Please, it begged, voice cracking, perfectly mimicking his own fear. Something's out here. It's coming. Open the door. A long pause. Then, I know you can hear me. Ethan reached up, his fingers trembling, and switched off the light. Darkness swallowed the cabin. His own voice sighed from behind the door. You're smarter than the last one, it murmured. A heavy silence followed. Then, without another sound, it was gone. Ethan didn't sleep that night, and when dawn finally arrived, there were footprints outside his door, bare, human, and identical to his own. The next morning, Ethan stood at the edge of the tower's deck, staring down at the footprints. They were his, or they should have been. Bare, identical, perfect. They led from the woods to his door, but there was something wrong about them. They weren't pressed into the dirt, they were etched, like the earth itself had been reshaped in his likeness. He swallowed hard. The rulebook sat on the desk inside, its pages now feeling less like an old joke and more like a lifeline. He flipped it open with shaking fingers and skimmed down. Rule #4. The forest doesn't always stay the same. The tree line may shift. Trails that existed yesterday may not be there tomorrow. If you ever notice a path leading toward your tower that wasn't there before, do not follow it. Close the blinds and wait until sunrise. Ethan turned, grabbing his binoculars. The tree line had moved. He was sure of it. The trees seemed closer, pressing in like silent, waiting figures. But that wasn't the worst part. A new trail had appeared, a narrow, winding path carved through the undergrowth, leading directly to the base of his tower. It hadn't been there yesterday. A cold sweat crept along his spine. Do not follow it. Ethan backed away, closing the door. The sky was a sickly shade of gray, the kind of light that came before a storm, though the air was dead still. No wind, no rustling leaves. Something was out there. For hours he tried to distract himself. He forced himself to write in the logbook about the false fire. Didn't mention the thing inside it. Ate a can of soup he barely tasted. Tried to listen to music on his phone but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The sun dipped lower. He tried not to check the window, but the instinct was too strong. The trail was closer now, not longer, closer. The dirt path had shifted just slightly, but enough to make his stomach churn. It had reached the first step of his tower staircase. The forest had moved again. Something wanted him to come down. A shape shifted between the trees, barely visible. A hand reached out, fingers curling around a branch, pulling it aside. Not human fingers. Ethan clenched his jaw and slammed the blinds shut. Wait until sunrise. That night, he didn't sleep. And just before dawn, something walked up the stairs. It stopped at his door and waited. Ethan sat in the dark, gripping the hatchet he'd found under the cabin sink. It wasn't much, but it was something. A cold reassurance in his trembling hands. Outside, the footsteps had stopped. Whoever or whatever had walked up the stairs wasn't knocking. It wasn't trying to break in. It was just standing there, waiting. Ethan's breath came shallow and ragged. Don't open the door. Don't look. Hours passed in unbearable silence, the weight of the unknown pressing against his skull like iron nails. Then, at some point near dawn, the footsteps descended the stairs. When he finally peeked out the window, there was nothing there. The new trail was gone, but something worse had taken its place. A silhouette stood on the ridge. Ethan's pulse lurched. It was too far away to make out any details, just a dark figure, tall, thin, motionless, watching. He swallowed hard and stepped away from the window. His hand hovered over the binoculars. Don't look directly at it. That was Rule #5. If you look at the watcher, it will take a step closer. If you blink too many times, it will reach the base of your tower. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. It's fine, just don't look. He forced himself to make breakfast, heat up stale coffee, and ignore the feeling that something was out there, waiting for him to make a mistake. But curiosity gnawed at him like a festering wound. By afternoon, his resolve broke. He picked up the binoculars. The figure stood exactly where it had that morning, unmoving, its face obscured by distance. Ethan's heart pounded. His pulse roared in his ears. It was just standing there. He adjusted the focus. The moment the figure sharpened into view, it moved. One step closer. Ethan nearly dropped the binoculars. He stumbled back, breath hitching in his throat. Did that just happen? Hesitantly, he lifted them again. The figure took another step forward. His stomach lurched. He blinked. Another step. He blinked again. It was closer now. No features, no details. Just a silhouette, watching him, waiting. A primal panic gripped his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. He slammed the blinds shut, heart thudding. Outside, the wind had finally picked up, and he could swear, somewhere in the rustling leaves, he heard breathing. Ethan didn't open the blinds for the rest of the day. He paced the cabin, unable to sit still. The watcher on the ridge wouldn't be able to move unless he looked at it again. But the idea of it just standing out there, waiting, watching, it made his skin crawl. As the sun began to set, the sky turned a bruised purple. The wind howled through the trees, making the old tower creak and groan. A new rule surfaced in his mind. 6. The fire tower is taller than it looks. Don't look down at night. Ethan hesitated. He'd already learned firsthand that the rules weren't a joke. He should stay inside, but something compelled him. The wind had knocked his camp chair over on the deck. A minor thing, but he fixated on it. A reason to step outside. A test. He opened the door and stepped out onto the deck. The forest stretched before him, an ocean of blackened trees beneath the fading light. His skin prickled, but nothing seemed wrong. Then he made a mistake. He looked down. His heart stopped. The ground was too far away. Not just a little. Not just a trick of perspective. It was wrong. Instead of the usual 50 feet, the tower stretched hundreds, no thousands of feet above the trees. The world tilted beneath him, the sky spinning. And there was something below. Movement, shapes shifting in the darkness, writhing just out of focus. His ears rang, his vision tunneling. The ground wasn't just farther away, it was alive. Something down there was reaching for him. Ethan tried to move, but his legs locked in place, his body caught in some terrible gravitational pull. He could hear his name somewhere below, distant and stretching, like it had been caught in a vast, endless tunnel. His knees buckled, his fingers trembled. Then a hand curled over the railing, not his. Something pale, too long, too thin. It was pulling itself up. Panic exploded in his chest. He staggered backwards, slamming into the door. The wood creaked, and for a horrifying moment, he thought he would fall. But then he was inside. The door slammed shut. His breath came in ragged gasps. He refused to look outside, because he knew the thing from below was still climbing. Ethan didn't move from the floor for a long time. His back was pressed against the locked door, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. His heartbeat hammered in his ears, drowning out the creaking of the tower in the wind. Something had been down there, and now it was climbing. His hands clenched into fists. I should leave, I should run, but where? The forest moved. The paths changed. The rules weren't suggestions. They were survival tactics. If he ran, he'd break one of them, and he wasn't sure he'd live to regret it. A deep breath. Get it together. Then, a knock at the door. Ethan's entire body went rigid. It wasn't like the knocking from the night before. This was different. Firm, slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. A voice followed, muffled through the wood. Calm, even. Ethan? His stomach lurched. The voice was different from the thing that had mimicked him before. This one was deeper, authoritative. I need to speak with you, the voice continued. It's Supervisor Graves. Ethan's blood turned to ice. Graves had left. He'd walked into the forest and never returned. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Ethan, open the door. A memory surfaced in his mind, something he'd almost forgotten, one of the rules. 7. If someone claims to be your supervisor but has no face, lock the door. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. Don't look, don't speak. Outside, the thing that called itself Graves exhaled slowly, like an exhausted parent trying to reason with a stubborn child. I know this job is difficult, it said. I know you've been seeing things, hearing things. Ethan bit his lip so hard he tasted blood. But I'm here to help, the voice went on, soothing, patient. I need you to open the door, Ethan. I need to see you. Silence. Then, a wet, scraping sound, like something dragging across the wood. His breath hitched. Don't look, don't look, don't look. Then the voice changed. It distorted, words stretching and breaking as if something inside its throat was tearing. Open the door, Ethan. Ethan's entire body trembled. Then the air outside the door shifted. A slow, deliberate inhale, and the voice whispered, barely audible, I know you're listening. Then silence. But he didn't dare move, because he knew if he opened that door, Graves wouldn't have a face. Ethan didn't move. He sat there, hands curled into fists, waiting. The thing that called itself Graves was gone, but the air still felt wrong, thick, heavy, charged with something he couldn't name. Slowly, painfully, he got to his feet and moved toward the desk. His hands shook as he flipped open the logbook. If he had any hope of making it through this job, he needed to document everything. The fire that wasn't real, the thing on the ridge, the climbing thing, the faceless not Graves. He picked up the pen and hesitated. 8. The logbook writes back, never ask it questions. Ethan exhaled through his nose. Fine, no questions, just observations. He pressed the tip of the pen to the page and scrawled, 2:13 a.m. The man on the radio spoke to me. It knew things about my life. 3:45 a.m. Saw fire. No smoke. Not real. Something inside the flames. It waved. 11:59 p.m. Locked the door. Something mimicked my voice. It begged, left footprints identical to mine. Day 2. The forest moved. A new trail appeared leading to my tower. It reached the first step before vanishing. Saw a figure on the ridge. Looked through binoculars. It moved when I looked. Closer. Won't look again. Tower changed. Looked down at night. Wrong. It was taller. Something climbing up. Didn't see its face. Something pretended to be Graves. Knocked. Told me to open the door. It wasn't him. Didn't open it. He paused. The pen hovered over the next line. Then, against his better judgment, he added one more sentence. What is happening here? The second the words hit the page, a gust of wind slammed against the tower, rattling the windows. Ethan nearly dropped the pen. His pulse roared in his ears as he watched. The logbook wrote back. The ink bled onto the page, spreading like rot, letters forming in shaky, uneven strokes. You don't want to know. Ethan's breath hitched. The air in the cabin felt thicker, pressing in on him from all sides. The logbook wasn't finished. Another line scrawled itself onto the paper, slower this time. Why are you still here? Ethan snapped the book shut so hard the desk rattled. His entire body was ice. The rules were meant to protect him, and he had just broken one. From outside the tower, something scratched against the window pane, something that hadn't been there before. Ethan didn't breathe. The scratching at the window pane was slow, deliberate, fingernails dragging across the glass. He didn't look. His mind raced, heart hammering in his chest. I broke the rule. The logbook had answered, and now something had come for him. The air inside the cabin felt different, thicker, heavier, pressing in like the walls themselves were inching closer. The silence stretched, unbearable. Then footsteps from the stairs. Ethan's stomach dropped. Someone was climbing up, step by step. The wood groaned beneath the weight of something that should not be there. Ethan forced himself to move, reaching for the hatchet he had left beside the desk. His fingers barely curled around the handle when the door creaked open, and he walked in. Ethan's lungs locked. It was him, same face, same clothes, same exhausted, sleep-deprived eyes. The other Ethan smiled, soft, calm. Everything is fine, it said. Ethan couldn't breathe. The rules, the final rule, 10. If a second you walks into the tower, you have 10 seconds to kill it. His grip tightened on the hatchet. The other Ethan took a step forward, head tilting slightly. You don't have to do that, it said, voice gentle, patient, identical to his own. Ethan's fingers trembled. How do I know it's not me? What if I'm the fake? The other Ethan stepped toward the desk. 7 seconds. Ethan's vision blurred, the air thick with something his mind refused to process. His double moved easily, effortlessly, as if it had always belonged here. 5 seconds. It reached out, fingers grazing the chair. If it sits, I die. 3 seconds. It turned toward him, smiling that same calm, understanding smile. 2. Come on, it whispered. You're so tired, Ethan. Let me take over. 1. Ethan swung the hatchet. The blade bit deep into flesh, and the thing that wore his face finally screamed. It wasn't his voice anymore. It was wrong. It collapsed, its body contorting, flesh unraveling into something wet, rotted, inhuman. It twisted and shrank until nothing was left but a pale stain on the wooden floorboards. Ethan stood there, panting, trembling, staring at the empty space where it had stood. Outside, the forest was silent. The air was still. Then, as if nothing had ever happened, the radio crackled to life. A voice whispered, soft, familiar. See you tomorrow, Ethan. I've lived in this neighborhood for almost 5 years now, and it's always been a peaceful place. You know, the kind where everyone waves when they pass by and kids ride their bikes up and down the street until dusk. It's the sort of neighborhood where nothing ever really happens, until it does. My neighbor Jimmy has always been a bit of an oddball, but in a harmless way. He's the kind of guy who keeps to himself, mows his lawn at precisely 6:01 a.m. every Saturday, and never has guests over. We exchanged pleasantries when we crossed paths, but that was about it. He seemed like a quiet, reserved person, which I appreciated. In a world full of noise, it's nice to have a neighbor who minds their own business. But then I started noticing things. Little things at first, barely enough to raise suspicion, but enough to stick in my mind like a thorn you can't quite pull out. For one, Jimmy didn't seem to age. Now, I'm not saying he's a vampire or anything, but in the 5 years I've known him, he's looked exactly the same. Not a single wrinkle or gray hair. I used to joke to myself that he must have some killer skincare routine. but the longer I thought about it, the less funny it seemed. It wasn't just his appearance that was strange, it was the way he moved. Have you ever seen someone walk in a way that feels off? Like their limbs are a bit too long, or their joints don't quite bend the right way? That's how Jimmy moves. It's subtle, almost imperceptible if you're not looking for it. But once you notice it, you can't unsee it. One night, I was taking out the trash when I saw him standing in his yard just staring up at the sky. I figured he was just looking at the stars, but then I noticed his head was tilted at a strange angle, almost like it wasn't properly attached to his neck. I must have stood there for a good 5 minutes just watching him stand there, unmoving. Finally, I shook it off and went back inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, I did what any curious person might do. I Googled weird neighbor behavior. I wasn't expecting to find anything, maybe a few forum posts from people with overactive imaginations, but then I stumbled across something that chilled me to the bone. There was a thread on Reddit about strange occurrences with neighbors, and one user mentioned something about shapeshifters. I rolled my eyes at first. I mean, shapeshifters? Really? But the more I read, the more uneasy I felt. People were sharing stories that sounded eerily similar to what I was experiencing. Neighbors who didn't age, who moved in ways that defied explanation, who seemed to be imitating humans, but not quite getting it right. It was disturbing, to say the least, but I wasn't ready to believe that Jimmy was anything other than a peculiar guy. That was, until I came across a link to a dark web forum. I'd always heard about the dark web, but I'd never ventured into it myself. The stories alone were enough to keep me away. But my curiosity was piqued, and before I knew it, I was following the rabbit hole down into a place I wasn't sure I wanted to be. The forum was full of conspiracy theories, most of which I immediately dismissed as nonsense. But there was one thread that caught my attention. How to identify shapeshifters in your neighborhood. The post was written by someone who claimed to have encountered a shapeshifter firsthand. They detailed signs that matched up with what I'd seen in Jimmy: lack of aging, odd movements, unnatural behavior, and then they dropped a bombshell. According to this user, shapeshifters are known to take the form of people who are socially isolated, people like Jimmy, who had no close friends or family nearby. The poster suggested that these beings weren't just copying human appearances, they were replacing the originals. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I read those words. I wanted to close the page and forget what I'd seen, but I couldn't. The thought kept gnawing at me. What if Jimmy wasn't just odd? What if he wasn't Jimmy at all? I started paying closer attention, watching him whenever I could without being too obvious. I noticed that he never left his house for more than a few minutes at a time. He didn't go to work, didn't run errands, just stayed inside, except for his daily walks around the block. And those walks were another thing that bothered me. He didn't seem to be walking to any particular destination. It was like he was just patrolling. Then there were the sounds. Late at night, I started hearing strange noises coming from his house. Not loud enough to wake the whole neighborhood, but just loud enough to reach my ears through the thin walls. It sounded like scratching, like something trying to get out. I knew I was letting my imagination get the better of me, but once the seed of doubt was planted, it grew like a weed. Every interaction with Jimmy felt like a test, like I was trying to catch him slipping up, revealing something he shouldn't. But he was always polite, always just normal enough to keep me questioning my sanity. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no way to prove it. After all, who would believe me? A man who doesn't age and moves like a puppet on strings. They'd think I was crazy. But I wasn't crazy. I knew what I saw, and I knew there was something off about Jimmy. I just had to figure out what. And that's when I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I reached out to the user who posted on the dark web forum. I didn't expect a response. After all, these forums were supposed to be anonymous, but to my surprise, they replied within an hour. Their message was brief, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "You're not alone, watch your back." I didn't know what to do with that information, but it was enough to keep me up that night, staring at the ceiling, listening for those strange noises next door. I knew then that I was in way over my head, but there was no turning back. I had to know the truth, no matter how disturbing it might be. After that cryptic message from the dark web user, I couldn't stop thinking about Jimmy. My mind raced with all sorts of possibilities, none of them comforting. Every time I saw him, it was like I was looking at him through a different lens, searching for any cracks in the facade. But Jimmy, or whoever he was, played his part perfectly. It was almost maddening. One night, a few days after I received that eerie message, something happened that pushed my curiosity into overdrive. I had just finished watching a movie and was getting ready for bed when I heard a loud thud from Jimmy's house. It was different from the usual scratching noises I'd heard before. This was heavy, like something, or someone, had fallen. I quickly turned off my lights, not wanting to alert him that I was watching, and peeked through the blinds. His house was dark, except for a faint flickering light coming from one of the windows. It wasn't the steady glow of a lamp or a TV. It was erratic, like a strobe light, casting strange shadows on the walls. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Something was definitely wrong. I debated whether or not to call the police, but what would I tell them? That my neighbor's house had weird lights and noises? They'd chalk it up to a faulty light bulb or an overactive imagination. And honestly, I wasn't even sure what I wanted them to find. Part of me was terrified of what the truth might be. Instead, I grabbed my phone and started recording, zooming in on the window with the flickering light. I figured if something truly bizarre happened, at least I'd have proof. As I watched, the light suddenly went out, plunging the house into darkness. I waited, heart pounding, for something to happen, but everything was quiet, too quiet. Then out of the darkness I saw a shadow move past the window. It was quick, almost too quick to notice, but I caught it. A tall, lanky figure that didn't quite move like a human should. It was more of a glide than a walk, like it was floating just above the ground. I stopped recording and backed away from the window, my mind racing. This wasn't normal. No one moved like that. No one human, at least. The next day I couldn't focus on anything. I went about my routine, but my mind was glued to the events of the previous night. I couldn't shake the image of that shadow, the way it moved, the unnaturalness of it all. I knew I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. That evening, I decided to confront Jimmy. It was a reckless idea, but I couldn't just sit around doing nothing. I told myself I'd keep it casual. Maybe ask him if he'd heard the noise last night, see if I could get a read on him. When I knocked on his door, it took him a few moments to answer. When he finally did, he looked off. His clothes were slightly disheveled, which was odd for him considering how meticulous he usually was. But what really caught my attention was his eyes. They were bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days, and there was something almost predatory about the way they fixed on me. "Hey, Jimmy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you hear that loud noise last night? I thought something might have fallen." He blinked, as if processing my question took more effort than it should. "No," he finally replied, his voice flat and emotionless. "Didn't hear anything." There was a coldness in his tone that made my skin crawl. I forced a smile, trying to hide my unease. "Must have been my imagination then. Sorry to bother you." He didn't respond, just kept staring at me with those unsettling eyes. I muttered a quick goodbye and turned to leave, but as I walked away I could feel his gaze burning into the back of my head. It was like he was studying me, trying to figure out what I knew. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every rustle outside my window made me jump. I kept thinking about the way Jimmy looked at me, the way his eyes seemed to pierce right through me. I knew I needed to be careful, but I also knew I couldn't let this go. The next morning, I decided to do some research. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I figured I'd start with the obvious. Missing persons reports, strange occurrences in the area, anything that might give me a clue as to what was really going on. I spent hours combing through local news archives, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Frustrated, I almost gave up. But then, I remembered something the user on the dark web had mentioned. Shapeshifters sometimes leave traces, small things they can't quite mimic perfectly. I didn't know what that meant exactly, but it gave me an idea. I decided to check out Jimmy's yard. It was a long shot, but maybe I'd find something, some clue that would confirm my suspicions. I waited until late afternoon when I knew he'd be on his walk and slipped over the fence into his backyard. The first thing I noticed was how pristine everything was. Not a blade of grass out of place, not a single weed in sight. It was almost unnaturally perfect. But as I walked further, I spotted something that made my heart skip a beat. Near the back of the yard, partially hidden behind a bush, was a small patch of disturbed earth. It looked like something had been buried there recently. I knelt down and brushed away the loose dirt, revealing what looked like clothing. It was a shirt, the fabric worn and frayed, but what really caught my attention was the smell. It was faint, but unmistakable, a sickly sweet odor, like rotting fruit. My mind raced. What was Jimmy hiding back here? Why would he bury a shirt in his yard? The logical part of my brain told me to stop, to leave before I got caught, but I couldn't. I kept digging, hoping to uncover more clues, but the further I dug, the more the smell intensified. Suddenly I heard a noise behind me, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and slowly turned around. There, standing just a few feet away, was Jimmy. His eyes were locked onto mine, and there was something in his expression that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't anger exactly, it was something more primal, more dangerous. "I didn't mean to intrude," I stammered, trying to keep my voice calm. I was just curious. He didn't respond, just kept staring at me with that cold, calculating gaze. For a moment I thought he might attack me, but then he just smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, though. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind that made you feel like you were being sized up. "You should leave," he said quietly, his voice low and threatening. Now. I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled to my feet and bolted back to my house, my heart racing. Once inside, I locked all the doors and windows, my mind reeling from what had just happened. What had I been thinking, snooping around like that? I was in way over my head, and I knew it. That night, I received another message from the dark web user. This time, it was even more unsettling. "He knows you're onto him. Be careful." I didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak and groan of the house felt like it was amplified 100 times. I knew I had pushed too far, and now there was no turning back. Whatever Jimmy, or the thing pretending to be Jimmy, was, it knew I was onto it. And that meant I was in danger. I just hoped I hadn't dug myself into a hole I couldn't climb out of. After the encounter in Jimmy's backyard, I tried to lay low. I wanted to believe that maybe I had misinterpreted everything, that perhaps the stress was getting to me, and I was just seeing things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was very wrong, and I had to figure out what it was before it was too late. I decided to avoid Jimmy altogether for a while, but that didn't stop the sense of dread from creeping in. Every time I left the house, I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. The paranoia was starting to take its toll, and I was beginning to doubt my own sanity. Then, a few days later, something happened that made me realize just how real the danger was. It was late in the evening, and I was sitting in my living room trying to distract myself with a book when I heard a knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat. No one ever came to visit me this late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I considered not answering, but the knocking continued, insistent and rhythmic. Cautiously, I approached the door and looked through the peephole. To my surprise, it wasn't Jimmy standing there. It was a woman I didn't recognize. She looked to be in her late 30s with dark hair pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore a simple, nondescript outfit. Something about her presence felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. "Who is it?" I called through the door, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice calm and measured. "But I need to talk to you about your neighbor, Jimmy." My stomach tightened. How did she know about Jimmy, and why would she come to me? I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. "Who are you?" I asked. "My name is Sarah," she replied. "I'm investigating something, and I believe you might have some information that could help." Investigating? This was starting to feel like one of those crime dramas on TV, except it was happening to me, and I had no idea what was going on. But something in her tone convinced me to take a chance. Maybe she knew something I didn't, something that could explain everything. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. "Thank you," she said as she stepped inside. She glanced around the living room as if assessing the situation, then turned her attention back to me. "I know this is sudden, but I need to ask you some questions about your neighbor. Have you noticed anything unusual about him?" I nodded slowly, unsure of how much to reveal. "Yeah, I've noticed some things. But before I say anything more, I need to know who you really are and what's going on." Sarah sighed and sat down on the edge of the couch, as if the weight of her mission was pressing down on her. "I work for an organization that tracks unusual phenomena," she began, choosing her words carefully. "We've been monitoring certain individuals who exhibit behaviors that aren't entirely human." My heart pounded in my chest. "So you think Jimmy is one of these individuals?" She nodded. "We've been watching him for some time, but we haven't been able to get close enough to confirm anything. That's why I'm here. We believe he may be a shapeshifter, and if that's the case, he could be very dangerous." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unsettling. I didn't want to believe it, but everything I'd experienced so far lined up with what she was saying. This was real. "I've seen things," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Things that don't make sense. He doesn't age. He moves. Strangely. And there was something buried in his yard. But I didn't get a good look before he caught me." Sarah's eyes widened slightly and she leaned forward. "Did he see you?" I nodded again, feeling a shiver run down my spine. "He did, and he wasn't happy about it." She closed her eyes briefly, as if weighing the gravity of the situation. "That's not good. If he knows you're onto him, he could see you as a threat." A threat. The word sent a chill through me. I'd been so focused on figuring out what was going on that I hadn't fully considered the danger I was putting myself in. But it was too late to back out now. I needed to see this through. "What do we do?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to gather evidence," she said, her tone turning serious. "But we have to be careful. If we push too hard, he might disappear, or worse, he might decide to deal with you." The thought of Jimmy, or whatever he was, deciding to deal with me, made my blood run cold. But I knew she was right. If we were going to get to the bottom of this, we had to be smart about it. "Do you have any idea what he might be planning?" I asked, feeling a growing sense of urgency. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "We've noticed a pattern with these shapeshifters. They often take the place of someone who is isolated, like Jimmy, and then they start to change. Not just physically, but their behavior becomes more erratic, more dangerous. We think they're preparing for something, but we don't know what." My mind raced as I processed what she was saying. If Jimmy was indeed one of these creatures, then whatever he was planning couldn't be good. I felt a pang of fear, not just for myself, but for everyone in the neighborhood. What if he wasn't the only one? We need to act fast, Sarah continued. I'm going to set up some equipment to monitor him, but I'll need your help. You're the closest one to him. You'll be our eyes and ears. The thought of spying on Jimmy sent a jolt of anxiety through me, but I knew it was the only way. I had already gone too far to turn back now. I'll do it, I said, my voice firm despite the fear gnawing at my insides. But what happens if we find out he really is a shapeshifter? What do we do then? Sarah looked at me with a seriousness that made my heart sink. Then we do whatever it takes to stop him. She didn't elaborate on what that meant, but I had a feeling it wasn't going to be pretty. As she started unpacking some strange-looking devices from her bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were playing with fire. Whatever we were about to uncover, it wasn't going to be something we could easily walk away from. As Sarah worked, setting up the equipment near the windows and in places where Jimmy couldn't see, I couldn't help but glance out the window at his house. It looked so normal from the outside, just like any other house on the block. But now I knew better. Behind those walls, something dark and dangerous was lurking, and it had been living right next door to me all this time. Sarah finished setting up the last piece of equipment and turned to me. I'll be monitoring from a distance, but if anything happens, anything at all, you need to contact me immediately. I nodded, taking the card she handed me with her contact information. My heart was pounding in my chest as I saw her out the door, the weight of what we were about to do pressing down on me. As I locked the door behind her, I realized that there was no turning back now. I was in this, and I had to see it through to the end, no matter how terrifying that end might be. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. Every noise, every creak of the house felt amplified in the darkness. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, fears, and what-ifs. What if we were wrong? What if Jimmy wasn't a shapeshifter at all, but something even worse? I didn't know what the next few days would bring, but one thing was certain. My life would never be the same after this. The next few days felt like I was living on the edge of a knife. Every time I stepped outside or glanced out the window, I half expected to see Jimmy, or whatever he was, watching me. The tension was unbearable, but I had to keep up appearances, pretending everything was normal while Sarah monitored the situation from a distance. She had set up small cameras and audio devices around the perimeter of my house and pointed them toward Jimmy's property. They were discreet, hidden within the natural landscape of my yard, but effective. Sarah assured me that if anything unusual happened, she'd know about it immediately. Despite her reassurances, I couldn't shake the fear that I was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was a gnawing, constant presence that made my skin crawl. I kept my curtains closed, avoided going outside unless absolutely necessary, and even started leaving the lights on at night, something I'd never done before. Then late one night, something happened that made everything worse. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard the sound. At first I thought I was dreaming. It was a low, almost inaudible hum, like the distant buzz of machinery. But as I slowly woke up, I realized it wasn't just in my head. The sound was real, and it was coming from outside. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The hum was growing louder, more insistent, and I knew I had to check it out. I grabbed my phone and crept to the window, peering through the narrow gap between the curtains. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The street was quiet, the houses dark and still, just as they should be at this hour. But then, as I scanned the area, my eyes caught something strange. There was a faint, bluish light coming from Jimmy's house. It wasn't bright, more like a soft glow, but it was unmistakable. The light was pulsing gently, almost in time with the hum, and it seemed to be coming from inside his house, as if something were glowing through the walls. I immediately texted Sarah, my fingers trembling as I typed out the message. "There's a strange light coming from Jimmy's house. It's glowing," she responded almost instantly. "Don't move, I'm on my way." I stayed by the window, watching that eerie light pulse and flicker, feeling like I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching out longer than the last, until finally, I saw headlights approaching from down the street. It was Sarah, and she parked a little ways down the road, careful not to draw any attention to herself. I let her in through the back door, and she immediately went to the window to see for herself. The glow was still there, and I could see the concern etched on her face as she observed it. "This is bad," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "We need to get a closer look, but we have to be careful." My stomach twisted with fear at the thought of getting any closer to that house, but I knew there was no other way. If we wanted answers, we had to take the risk. Sarah pulled out a small device from her bag. It looked like a handheld scanner, something you might see in a science fiction movie. "This will help us detect any unusual energy readings," she explained. "If Jimmy, or whatever he is emitting that light, we might be able to confirm what we're dealing with." I nodded, trying to steel myself for what was to come. Together, we quietly slipped out the back door and made our way across the yard, sticking to the shadows. The night air was cool, but I was sweating, my nerves on edge. As we approached Jimmy's house, the hum grew louder, vibrating in my chest like an engine revving up. The light was more intense now, casting strange, elongated shadows across the lawn. It felt like we were approaching some sort of barrier, something that wasn't meant to be crossed. Sarah motioned for me to stop a few feet from the house. She activated the scanner, and it immediately began to beep, the frequency of the beeps increasing as we got closer to the source of the light. "This is definitely not normal," Sarah muttered, her eyes fixed on the screen. "The energy readings are off the charts. Whatever is in there, it's not human." A chill ran down my spine. "So what do we do now?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She was focused on the readings, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then, just as she seemed to be on the verge of saying something, the light inside Jimmy's house suddenly went out. The hum stopped as well, plunging the night back into an eerie silence. We both froze, our eyes locked on the darkened windows. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure Sarah could hear it. Had Jimmy, whatever he was, noticed us? Was he coming for us? Before we could decide what to do, we heard the sound of a door creaking open. It was the back door of Jimmy's house, and a moment later, a figure stepped out into the yard. It was Jimmy, or at least it looked like Jimmy. But something was different. He wasn't moving like a normal person. His steps were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical, and his eyes. Even from where we were standing, I could see that they weren't quite right. They didn't reflect the light the way human eyes should. Instead, they seemed to absorb it, like two dark voids. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't Jimmy. It couldn't be. Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "We need to go, now." We backed away slowly, careful not to make any noise, but it felt like Jimmy, whatever he was, could see us even in the dark. As we retreated, I saw him tilt his head slightly, as if listening for something. Then, without warning, he started walking in our direction. Panic surged through me, and I nearly bolted, but Sarah held me back. "Stay calm," she whispered urgently. "We can't let him know we're here." We crouched down behind a bush, barely daring to breathe as Jimmy, or the thing pretending to be Jimmy, walked past us. He was so close I could smell a faint metallic odor coming off him, like old blood or rust. My skin prickled with fear, and I had to fight the urge to run. But then, just as suddenly as he had started moving, Jimmy stopped. He stood there for a moment, motionless, as if listening again. Then, without turning around, he walked back to his house and disappeared inside, the door closing softly behind him. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I was holding, my body shaking with adrenaline. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Sarah didn't answer right away. She was still watching the house, her face pale. "That wasn't human," she finally said, her voice barely audible. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't human. The reality of what she was saying hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just some weird neighbor with strange habits. This was something far more sinister, something that defied explanation. We need to get out of here, Sarah said, pulling me to my feet. We have to figure out what we're dealing with before it's too late. We hurried back to my house, every shadow feeling like it was hiding something terrible. Once inside, Sarah quickly packed up her equipment, her movements sharp and efficient. We're not safe here, she said, her tone urgent. I need to analyze this data and figure out our next move. I suggest you stay somewhere else for a few days. Don't come back here until I contact you. The thought of leaving my home, my safe space, was terrifying, but I knew she was right. Whatever was living next door, it was dangerous, and staying here would only put me at greater risk. I grabbed a few essentials and followed Sarah out to her car, my heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at Jimmy's house. It looked so normal in the dark, just another suburban home. But I knew the truth now. There was something terrible lurking behind those walls, something that was wearing Jimmy's face but wasn't Jimmy at all. And I had a feeling that whatever it wasn't done with me yet. I spent the next 2 days at a friend's place, jumping every time the phone rang or I heard a knock at the door. The anxiety was overwhelming, and every minute that passed without hearing from Sarah felt like an eternity. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of everything, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. How had I ended up in the middle of something so terrifying, so bizarre? Finally, on the third day, I received a message from Sarah. I have answers. Meet me at the cafe on Maple Street at 6 p.m. Come alone. The message was brief and to the point, but it sent a chill down my spine. Answers were what I wanted, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear them. Still, I knew I didn't have a choice. I needed to know what we were up against, no matter how terrifying it might be. When I arrived at the cafe, Sarah was already there, seated at a corner table. She looked more serious than I'd ever seen her, her expression tight with concern. I sat down across from her, my heart pounding in my chest. What did you find out? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah didn't waste any time. She pulled out a small notebook and placed it on the table between us. I analyzed the data we collected, and it's worse than I thought. The energy readings, the behavior, it all points to one thing. Jimmy isn't just a shapeshifter. He's something much older, much more dangerous. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? She flipped open the notebook, revealing pages filled with notes and diagrams. There's an ancient entity, often referred to in folklore as a doppelganger. But this isn't just a copy of a person. It's a being that takes over the life of the original, mimicking them so perfectly that no one suspects a thing. But unlike the folklore, this entity isn't harmless. It feeds on fear, on the energy of those around it. The longer it stays in one place, the stronger it becomes. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. So Jimmy, the real Jimmy? Sarah nodded grimly. He's gone. This thing has taken over his life completely. And now it's been feeding off the fear in the neighborhood, growing stronger. That's why it noticed you. You were a threat because you started to suspect. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The realization that my neighbor, the man I'd seen almost every day for years, had been replaced by something so malevolent was too much to bear. And worse, I had no idea how long it had been going on. So what do we do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How do we stop it? Sarah hesitated, her expression troubled. There's no easy way to deal with something like this. We can't confront it directly. It's too powerful now. But there might be a way to weaken it, to force it to leave. Doppelgangers are tied to the place they inhabit, but they're also tied to the identity they've stolen. If we can break its connection to Jimmy's identity, it might be forced to abandon the form it's taken. But how do we do that? I asked, the desperation in my voice evident. Sarah leaned in closer, lowering her voice. We need to expose it, publicly. If we can show others that this isn't Jimmy, if we can make it impossible for the doppelganger to maintain the illusion, it might be forced to reveal itself or leave. But we have to be careful. If it realizes what we're doing, it could retaliate. The plan was risky, but it was the only option we had. I agreed to help, even though the thought of confronting that thing sent a shiver down my spine. The next day, we put our plan into action. Sarah had managed to get some local news reporters interested in a human interest story about longtime residents in the neighborhood. She arranged for them to interview Jimmy, under the guise of celebrating his years in the community while we observed from a distance. The idea was simple. We'd set up a situation where Jimmy would have to interact with people in ways that might trip him up. We were hoping that under the pressure, the doppelganger might reveal something off, something that couldn't be explained away. All we needed was one slip-up. The reporters arrived late in the afternoon, setting up their cameras and microphones in Jimmy's front yard. I watched from my car, parked a few houses down, my heart pounding. Sarah was nearby, ready to capture anything unusual on camera. Jimmy, if that's what he was, came out to greet them, just as we'd expected. He played the part perfectly, smiling and shaking hands, answering their questions with the same calm demeanor I'd always known him to have. But as the interview went on, I noticed something subtle. His movements were too deliberate, too calculated. It was as if he was mimicking human behavior, but didn't quite understand the nuances. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the reporters, a young woman, asked Jimmy a question about his past, about where he'd lived before moving to the neighborhood. It was a simple question, something anyone should have been able to answer easily. But Jimmy hesitated. It was only for a moment, but in that brief pause, I saw something flicker in his eyes. It was like a mask slipping, revealing something cold and alien beneath. The reporters didn't seem to notice, but I did. My heart raced as I watched him recover, smoothly giving a vague answer that didn't really say anything at all. Sarah must have noticed it too, because she immediately started texting me. "Did you see that? He slipped up. We need to press further." But before we could take any action, Jimmy did something that froze me in my tracks. He turned and looked directly at my car. His expression was blank, but his eyes, those dark, bottomless eyes, seemed to pierce right through the windshield, right into me. He knew. Panic surged through me, and I quickly ducked down, my hands shaking. How had he known I was there? I was sure I hadn't been spotted. But there was no mistaking it. Jimmy, or whatever he was, knew we were onto him. My phone buzzed with another text from Sarah. "Get out of there now." I didn't need to be told twice. I started the car and drove off, my heart pounding in my chest. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Jimmy watching me from his front yard. He wasn't smiling anymore. There was a cold, predatory look on his face that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't go back to my friend's place. Instead, I drove around aimlessly, trying to calm down and figure out what to do next. I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go home. Not until this was over. Hours later, Sarah called me. Her voice was tense, but there was a note of determination in it. "We need to escalate this. We've rattled him, and that's good. But it's not enough. We need to make him slip up in front of more people. People who won't just brush it off." We decided to take the risk and expose him at a community meeting. It was scheduled for the next day, and most of the neighborhood would be there. If we could get Jimmy to reveal himself in front of everyone, there'd be no hiding it. The next day, I arrived at the community center, trying to keep my nerves in check. Sarah was already there, blending in with the crowd. I could see the tension in her eyes, but she gave me a reassuring nod. Jimmy arrived right on time, just as he always did. He greeted everyone with the same practiced smile, but I could tell he was on edge. As the meeting progressed, Sarah and I exchanged nervous glances. This was it, our last chance to expose him. Then, the opportunity came. Someone brought up the subject of neighborhood security, and Jimmy was asked to speak about his experience living in the area. As he stood up to address the crowd, I could see the cracks starting to show. His movements were stiff, almost robotic, and there was a strange, distant look in his eyes. As he spoke, Sarah subtly began asking pointed questions. Questions designed to confuse him, to force him to think on his feet. The room was quiet. Everyone focused on Jimmy's answers, and I could see the pressure building. Then it happened. Jimmy's voice faltered. He stammered, searching for words, and for a brief moment his face seemed to shift. It was subtle, like a flicker of static on a TV screen, but it was enough. The crowd murmured, confused, and I saw the first flicker of doubt in their eyes. Sensing that he was losing control, Jimmy tried to regain his composure, but it was too late. The more he tried to cover his slip-up, the more obvious it became that something was wrong. The mask was slipping, and everyone could see it. Suddenly, without warning, Jimmy turned and bolted for the door. The crowd gasped, and Sarah and I sprang into action, following him out of the building. But by the time we reached the parking lot, he was gone. All that remained was a strange metallic odor in the air, the same smell I'd noticed that night in his yard. Jimmy, or whatever he was, had vanished, leaving nothing behind but questions and fear. In the days that followed, rumors spread throughout the neighborhood. People whispered about what had happened, about the strange things they'd noticed but never dared to mention. The police were called, but there was no trace of Jimmy anywhere. It was as if he had never existed. Sarah and I stayed in touch, but there were no more sightings, no more strange events. Whatever had taken over Jimmy's life was gone, but the memory of it lingered, a dark cloud over the neighborhood. I never returned to my house. I couldn't. Every time I thought about it, I was reminded of the horror that had unfolded there, the terror of living next door to something inhuman. I moved away, trying to start fresh, but the fear stayed with me, a constant reminder that some things in this world defy explanation. And as for Sarah, she continued her work, investigating the unknown, chasing down the things that hide in the shadows. But we both knew that what we had faced was just the beginning, that there were other doppelgangers out there living among us, waiting for the right moment to strike. And somewhere, out there in the dark, I knew Jimmy, or the thing that had taken his place, was still watching, still waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to let him in. I'm not exactly sure what I was thinking when I first stumbled into that chat room. I guess it was a mix of boredom and curiosity, like most bad decisions start out. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and I'd already gone down several rabbit holes on the internet, each more bizarre than the last. I'm not proud of it, but I'd recently developed a habit of browsing the dark web. It's not like I was looking for anything specific. I just found the idea of these hidden corners of the internet fascinating. It felt like stepping into a different world, one where the rules were different and the possibilities were endless. That night, after browsing through some forums, I noticed a chat room titled The Beyond. It had a few active users, which was rare for a place like this. The description was vague, just a few cryptic words about exploring the unknown. I hesitated for a second, but something about it pulled me in. Maybe it was the adrenaline rush, or maybe it was the eerie silence in my apartment, but before I knew it, I was in. The conversation was already in progress when I joined, filled with talk about paranormal experiences and haunted locations. Most of it seemed like the typical stuff you'd hear from people trying to scare each other, but one user stood out, someone with the username Moriarty. They weren't saying much, just dropping in strange, cryptic comments every now and then. It was enough to catch my attention. Then, out of nowhere, Moriarty messaged me directly. Ever been to a real haunted house? They asked. I wasn't sure how to respond. I mean, who asks that? But I was intrigued. I typed back something along the lines of, not really. Why? Their next message came almost immediately. I can offer you a free trip to one, a place you'll never forget. My heart skipped a beat. This had to be a joke, right? But part of me was hooked. There was something about Moriarty that felt different from the usual trolls you'd find online. I don't know how to explain it, but their messages felt real, dangerous even. I paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Every rational part of me was screaming not to engage further. But then, the thought crept in. What if this was legit? What if this was a chance to experience something completely out of the ordinary? I'm listening, I typed. The details came slowly, almost like Moriarty was testing me, seeing if I would back out. They described an old house on the outskirts of town, one that was supposedly abandoned but had a reputation for being haunted. It was the kind of place locals whispered about, but no one dared to visit. According to Moriarty, the house was more than just haunted. It was a place where the lines between the living and the dead blurred. I can arrange everything, Moriarty said. All you have to do is show up. Consider it an adventure. The idea was insane. I knew that. But something about the way they described the house, the atmosphere, the mystery, made me feel like I needed to see it for myself. Against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing. All right, I typed, my fingers trembling slightly as I hit send. When? Tomorrow night, they replied. I'll send you the location. Be there at midnight. I didn't sleep much after that. My mind was racing with thoughts of what I'd just agreed to. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just a thrill-seeking adventure, that nothing would happen. But deep down, I knew I was stepping into something far more sinister. The next day felt surreal. I went through my usual routine, but everything seemed off, like I was living in a dream. The anticipation built with each passing hour, a mix of excitement and dread swirling in my chest. By the time night fell, I was a bundle of nerves. I thought about backing out, but every time I considered it, I felt a strange pull, like something was guiding me forward. It was as if the decision was no longer mine to make. At 11:45 p.m., I left my apartment, driving through the deserted streets until I reached the edge of town. The address Moriarty had sent me led to a narrow, winding road that I'd never noticed before. The further I drove, the more isolated it became, the streetlights giving way to complete darkness. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my tires as I approached the house. When I finally saw it, my breath caught in my throat. The house was exactly as Moriarty had described, old, decrepit, and unsettlingly quiet. It sat at the end of a long driveway, half hidden by overgrown trees and bushes. The windows were dark, the kind of darkness that felt alive, like it was watching me. The air around it was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel an unnatural coldness seeping into my bones as I stepped out of the car. I stood there for a moment, staring at the house, wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get back in the car and drive away. But instead, I took a deep breath and walked towards the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a hallway bathed in shadows. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of decay. As I stepped inside, the floorboards groaned under my weight, the sound echoing through the empty space. It felt like the house was alive, breathing me in, waiting for me to make the next move. I pulled out my phone and sent a quick message to Moriarty, letting them know I'd arrived. There was no reply, just the sound of my own breathing filling the silence. I took a few more steps, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, and that's when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It was coming from deeper inside the house. My pulse quickened as I followed the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. I should have turned back right then and there, but something curiosity, stupidity, I don't know, kept me moving forward. Finally, I reached a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, the whispering louder now, though I still couldn't make out the words. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Everything in me screamed that this was a bad idea, that I needed to leave. But I ignored it and pushed the door open. What I saw inside nearly made me drop my phone. The room was small, with walls covered in strange, faded symbols that seemed to pulse in the dim light. In the center of the room was a chair, old and worn, with restraints hanging from the arms and legs. But it was the figure standing next to the chair that froze me in place. A man, tall and gaunt, with a face half hidden in shadows, was staring right at me. His eyes were cold, empty, like they'd seen things no human should ever witness. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there, watching me. I took a step back, my heart racing, and that's when I felt it. A hand, icy cold, grabbing my arm from behind. I whipped around, but there was no one there, just the cold seeping through my skin, tightening its grip. I yanked my arm free, stumbling back into the hallway. The man in the room hadn't moved, but I could feel his eyes on me, burning into my back as I turned and ran. The hallway seemed to close in around me, the walls narrowing, the shadows deepening. I could barely see the front door as I sprinted towards it, the whispering now a chorus, rising in intensity. The cold hand seemed to follow me, reaching out from the darkness, trying to pull me back. I burst through the door, nearly tripping over the threshold, and ran to my car. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I glanced back at the house, half expecting to see that man standing in the doorway watching me leave, but there was nothing, just the empty, silent house. I sped away, not looking back until I was far from that place. Only then did I notice the mark on my arm, a dark, bruise-like impression, almost like fingers where the cold hand had grabbed me. It ached, a dull pain that seemed to seep into my bones. I don't know how long I drove, but when I finally got home, it was nearly dawn. I collapsed onto my bed, exhausted, the events of the night replaying in my mind. I told myself it was over, that it was just a bad decision, a one-time thing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something had followed me out of that house, and I had a feeling this was just the beginning. The morning after my visit to the house, I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat. For a moment, I wasn't sure if everything that had happened the night before was real or just some twisted nightmare. But when I looked down at my arm and saw the bruise-like mark, dark and unmistakable, I knew it had been real. The mark wasn't just a bruise. It was cold to the touch, almost as if the chill from that ghostly hand had seeped into my skin and refused to leave. I tried rubbing it, hoping it would fade, but it stayed there, a haunting reminder of what had happened. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. I was too shaken, my mind replaying every detail of that night, trying to make sense of it. I spent hours just sitting in my apartment, staring at the mark on my arm, wondering if I should go to a doctor, or if they'd think I was crazy. How could I explain that this wasn't just a regular bruise, that something from the other side had reached out and touched me? I kept checking my phone, half expecting a message from Moriarty, but there was nothing. The chat room was gone too, like it had never existed. I even tried searching for it, but it was as if it had vanished into thin air. The whole thing left me feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. By the afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to talk to someone, to get this off my chest, but I wasn't sure who. My friends were the type who'd laugh off any mention of the supernatural, and I couldn't exactly call my family and say, "Hey, I think a ghost tried to kidnap me last night." So I did the next best thing. I went online. I found a forum dedicated to paranormal experiences, a place where people shared their stories about encounters with the unknown. It wasn't exactly the dark web, but it felt like the right place to start. I posted a detailed account of what had happened, leaving out the part about how I found the house. I didn't want to encourage anyone to make the same mistake I did. The responses started coming in almost immediately. Most were from skeptics, calling it a hoax or a hallucination, but a few stood out. People who claimed to have had similar experiences, who believed that some places were not just haunted, but dangerous. One user in particular caught my attention. They went by the name Seeker and seemed knowledgeable about the paranormal. Their message was short, but it sent chills down my spine. "You've been marked. It's not over." I stared at the screen, my heart racing. Marked? What did that even mean? I typed back a quick reply, asking for more information, but Seeker didn't respond. I tried sending them a private message, but it just sat in my outbox, unread. It was like they disappeared as soon as they sent the message. The word marked kept echoing in my head. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew there was something to it. The mark on my arm, the cold that wouldn't go away, it was all connected. But marked for what? I had no idea. Over the next few days, strange things started happening around my apartment. At first, it was small stuff. Doors creaking open on their own, lights flickering for no reason. But then it got worse. I'd hear faint whispers in the middle of the night, just like the ones I'd heard in the house. The temperature in my apartment would drop suddenly, and I'd feel that same icy touch on my skin, just for a moment, before it disappeared. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was still shaken from what had happened, but it was getting harder to ignore. The worst part was the nightmares. Every night, I'd dream of that house. Walking down the endless hallway, the man with the empty eyes watching me, the cold hand reaching out from the darkness. Each time, I'd wake up just before it grabbed me, my heart pounding, drenched in sweat. But one night the dream changed. I was back in the house, but this time I wasn't alone. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate, getting closer with each step. I tried to run, but it felt like I was moving through molasses, my legs barely responding. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, until I could finally make out the words. "Join us." I woke up with a gasp, my body trembling, but something was different. The mark on my arm, it was burning. Not just cold anymore, but searing hot like a brand. I rushed to the bathroom, turning on the light and holding my arm under the faucet, letting the cold water flow over it. The pain subsided, but the mark, it was darker, more defined. That was the moment I realized this wasn't something I could just ignore. Whatever had marked me wasn't going to leave me alone. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I spent the next day researching everything I could about hauntings, possessions, and marks left by spirits. Most of it was just superstition, but I found a few accounts that mentioned something similar to what I was experiencing. They talked about places that were cursed, where spirits could attach themselves to the living, marking them as a way to stay connected. I wasn't sure if I believed all of it, but one thing was clear. I needed to do something before it got worse. One of the accounts I found mentioned a ritual to cleanse a spirit's mark, something that could sever the connection. It was complicated, and I wasn't sure if I could do it on my own, but it was the only option I had. That night, I gathered the supplies the ritual required, a candle, salt, a few herbs that I had to order online, and prepared myself. I followed the instructions to the letter, drawing a circle of salt around me, lighting the candle, and reciting the words meant to cleanse the spirit's mark. I don't know what I expected to happen, but as soon as I finished the ritual, the candle flickered and went out. For a moment, everything was silent. Then a cold breeze swept through the room, strong enough to knock over the candle and scatter the salt. I froze, my heart pounding. The temperature dropped rapidly, the cold sinking into my bones, and I knew I wasn't alone. A whisper, soft and almost familiar, echoed in the darkness. "You can't escape." I backed away, my hands trembling, and that's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, standing in the corner of the room. It was the man from the house, his empty eyes staring right at me, unblinking. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The figure stepped forward, reaching out a hand, the same hand that had grabbed me in the house. The mark on my arm burned again, and I felt a pull like something was trying to drag me towards him. I fought it with everything I had, resisting the pull with sheer willpower, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The figure was gone, the room silent again. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my heart racing. The mark on my arm still burned, but it wasn't as intense as before. I knew then that the ritual hadn't worked, not completely. Whatever had marked me was still there, still connected. I stayed up the rest of the night, too scared to sleep, too scared to move. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. The mark was a constant reminder that something was still after me, and staying here meant putting myself in more danger. I needed help, real help, from someone who knew what they were dealing with. And there was only one person who came to mind, Seeker, the user who had warned me that it wasn't over. I just hoped they would respond before it was too late. After that night, I was more determined than ever to find Seeker. The realization that the ritual had failed, that whatever had marked me was still with me, pushed me to the edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that each day brought me closer to something I didn't want to face. I spent hours online, scouring forums, chat rooms, and even the dark web, trying to track down Seeker. It was like chasing a ghost. No pun intended. Every lead I found was a dead end. Messages went unanswered, profiles were inactive, and the deeper I searched, the more desperate I became. Days passed, and the strange occurrences in my apartment only got worse. The cold spots, the whispers, and the fleeting shadows became part of my daily routine. I started avoiding mirrors because I could swear I saw movement behind me that wasn't really there. Sleep was a luxury I no longer had. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, the man with the empty eyes, standing in the corner of my room watching, waiting. But I refused to give up. I knew Seeker was out there somewhere, and they were my only hope. It wasn't until nearly a week later that I got a breakthrough. I was scrolling through an old paranormal forum when I noticed a post from a user with a name similar to Seeker's, S33ker. The post was old, buried under years of inactivity, but it caught my attention because of its title, Escaping the Mark. I clicked on it, my heart pounding. The post was a detailed account of someone who had been marked by a spirit and how they had managed to break free. The similarities to my own situation were uncanny, right down to the physical mark on the arm. But what really grabbed me was the username. It had to be them. I sent a message to S33ker, explaining who I was and what had happened to me. I poured everything into that message, hoping that they would see the urgency and respond. I didn't have high hopes. After all, the post was years old, and the user hadn't been active for a long time. But it was my only lead, so I clung to it like a lifeline. For days, I checked my inbox obsessively, waiting for a reply that never came. The silence was maddening, and the haunting in my apartment grew more intense with each passing day. It was as if the spirit knew I was trying to escape, and it wasn't happy about it. The mark on my arm burned constantly now, a dull, throbbing pain that wouldn't go away. I tried everything to ease it, cold compresses, ointments, even painkillers, but nothing worked. One night, as I sat at my computer, exhausted and defeated, a notification popped up on my screen. It was a message from S33ker. My hand shook as I clicked on it, afraid that it might just be another dead end. But the moment I read the first line, I knew I had found the right person. I know what you're going through. Meet me at the address below. Come alone. The address was in the city, not too far from where I lived. It was a small, nondescript building in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing that screamed paranormal expert or anything like that, but I didn't care about the details. This was the first real sign of hope I'd had in days, and I wasn't about to let it slip away. I left my apartment that evening, the sun setting behind a layer of clouds, casting the city in an eerie, dim light. The drive to the address felt longer than it should have, my mind racing with thoughts of what I would find there. What kind of person was Seeker? Could they really help me? Or was I walking into another trap, one that I wouldn't be able to escape from? The building was a small brick structure wedged between a couple of old shops that looked like they hadn't seen business in years. The door was unmarked, with just a number stenciled above it. 33. I hesitated for a moment, standing on the sidewalk, staring at the door. Everything in me screamed to turn around, to get back in the car and drive as far away as I could. But I'd come too far to back out now. I needed answers, and this was the only way I was going to get them. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately, as if someone had been waiting for me. A man stood in the doorway, his face obscured by the shadows of the dimly lit hallway behind him. He was older, with graying hair and a serious expression that didn't do much to ease my nerves. "You must be the one with the mark," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, too anxious to speak. He stepped aside, motioning for me to enter. I hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The man led me down a narrow hallway and into a small room that looked like a cross between an office and a study. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with old dusty tomes that I didn't recognize. A single desk sat in the center of the room, cluttered with papers, a few candles, and a couple of strange-looking objects that I couldn't identify. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and the only light came from a lamp on the desk, casting long shadows across the room. "Sit," he said, pointing to a chair in front of the desk. I did as I was told, feeling the weight of his gaze on me as I settled into the chair. He didn't sit. Instead, he remained standing, studying me with an intensity that made me feel exposed, vulnerable. "You're in deep," he finally said, breaking the silence. "The mark you bear is not something to take lightly." "I figured that out," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you help me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached across the desk and grabbed a small vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. He held it up to the light, examining it before setting it back down. "What you're dealing with is an attachment," he explained. "A spirit, or something like it, that has latched onto you. The mark is a sign of its connection, a physical manifestation of its presence. It won't go away on its own, and the longer it stays, the stronger its hold on you will become." I swallowed hard, the reality of the situation settling in like a weight on my chest. "So, what do I do?" Seeker leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "You have to sever the connection, but it won't be easy. This spirit is powerful, and it's already begun to merge with your energy. If you don't act soon, it could take over completely." His words sent a chill through me. I had imagined this was bad, but I hadn't considered that it could get worse. "How do I sever it?" "There's a ritual," he said, his tone serious. "But it's dangerous. The spirit will fight back, and if you're not careful, it could end up killing you, or worse." I felt my stomach drop. "Worse?" He nodded grimly. "There are fates worse than death, especially when dealing with the paranormal. If the ritual fails, the spirit could trap your soul, keep you bound to it for eternity." I didn't know what to say. The fear that had been building inside me for days now felt like it was about to consume me whole. But I didn't have a choice. I couldn't keep living like this, with the constant fear, the nightmares, the feeling of being watched every second of the day. "What do I need to do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Seeker reached into a drawer in his desk and pulled out a small leather-bound book. He handed it to me, the cover worn and faded from years of use. "Everything you need to know is in here," he said. "Follow the instructions exactly. Don't skip any steps and don't try to cut corners." This ritual is your only chance to free yourself from the mark. I took the book, my hands trembling as I held it. The weight of the situation was almost too much to bear, but I forced myself to nod. Thank you. Seeker gave me a long, hard look, as if he was trying to gauge whether I was truly ready for what lay ahead. Finally, he nodded back. Good luck. You're going to need it. I left the building feeling a mix of dread and determination. The book in my hands felt like both a lifeline and a death sentence, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was making the right choice. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living like this. Whatever the risks, I had to try. That night I returned to my apartment, the weight of what I had to do pressing down on me. I opened the book and began to read, studying the ritual with a focus I hadn't felt in days. It was complex, filled with steps and symbols that were foreign to me, but I memorized every detail, knowing that any mistake could cost me dearly. As I prepared for the ritual, I felt the presence in my apartment growing stronger, the air thickening with an unseen force. The mark on my arm pulsed, as if it knew what I was planning. I knew that this would be the hardest fight of my life, but I had no other choice. The time had come to confront the spirit that had marked me, to face it head on, and to either sever the connection or be consumed by it. And as I gathered the materials for the ritual, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the spirit was already aware of my intentions. The final battle was about to begin. The night of the ritual arrived faster than I expected. Every minute leading up to it felt like a countdown to something I couldn't fully comprehend. The tension in my apartment had grown unbearable, the air thick with a presence I couldn't see but could definitely feel. It was as if the spirit knew what I was planning and was doing everything in its power to stop me. I'd spent the entire day preparing, double-checking the instructions in the book Seeker had given me, gathering the necessary materials and making sure everything was in place. The ritual required a number of specific items: candles, herbs, a small bowl of water, and a sharp knife, all arranged in a circle on the floor of my living room. The most important part was the symbol, a complex, intricate design that I had to draw in chalk within the circle. It was supposed to act as a barrier, keeping the spirit contained while I severed the connection. As I knelt down to draw the symbol, the mark on my arm began to burn again, more intensely than before. I gritted my teeth, trying to ignore the pain as I carefully traced each line, making sure the symbol was perfect. Any mistake, Seeker had warned, could result in disaster. Once the symbol was complete, I placed the items around the circle. The candles at the 4 points of the compass, the herbs scattered in between, the bowl of water in the center, and the knife just outside the circle within easy reach. The final step was to light the candles and recite the incantation from the book. My hands shook as I lit each candle, the tiny flames flickering in the darkness. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft crackle of the burning wicks. I could feel the spirit's presence growing stronger, as if it was gathering its strength for one final confrontation. Taking a deep breath, I opened the book to the page with the incantation. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, but I had practiced them over and over, committing each syllable to memory. As I began to speak, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, the cold seeping into my bones. The mark on my arm burned hotter, as if it was fighting against the ritual. I forced myself to continue, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides, but I kept my focus on the words, refusing to let the spirit's influence distract me. As I reached the final line of the incantation, the flames on the candles suddenly flared, their light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The cold intensified, and I felt a pressure on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I knew this was the spirit's last attempt to stop me, to keep its hold on me. With a final, trembling breath, I spoke the last word of the incantation. The reaction was immediate. The room plunged into darkness as all the candles went out at once, leaving me in pitch blackness. The pressure on my chest lifted, but in its place came a feeling of weightlessness, as if the very air around me had been sucked away. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, from the center of the circle, a faint light began to glow. It was the bowl of water, shimmering with an unnatural blue hue. The light grew brighter, illuminating the symbol on the floor and casting eerie shadows across the room. And then, I saw it. A figure began to take shape within the circle, slowly emerging from the light. It was the man from the house, the one with the empty eyes, but he looked different now. His features were more defined, his presence more solid. He stood in the center of the circle, staring at me with those same cold, unblinking eyes. For a moment, neither of us moved. The room was so silent that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't speak, but I could feel its intent, its desire to pull me into the circle, to claim me as its own. I reached for the knife, my hand shaking as I wrapped my fingers around the hilt. The ritual wasn't over yet. There was one final step, one final action that would sever the connection for good. I had to make a cut on my arm, directly over the mark, and let a drop of my blood fall into the bowl of water. It was supposed to symbolize the breaking of the bond, the release of the spirit's hold on me. But as I brought the knife to my skin, the figure moved. It lunged towards me, its hand reaching out just like it had in the house. But this time, it couldn't leave the circle. The symbol on the floor flared to life, glowing with a bright white light that repelled the figure, forcing it back. It let out a low guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a whisper, as it struggled against the barrier. I didn't hesitate. With one quick motion, I pressed the knife against the mark on my arm, the blade slicing through my skin. The pain was sharp, but I didn't flinch. I held my arm over the bowl, letting a single drop of blood fall into the glowing water. The reaction was immediate. The light in the bowl flared, so bright that I had to shield my eyes. The figure within the circle let out a howl, a sound so filled with rage and despair that it chilled me to the core. The room shook, the walls rattling as if the very foundations of the building were being torn apart. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The light faded, the figure vanished, and the room was plunged into silence once more. The only sound was the faint crackling of the candles, which had somehow reignited themselves. The cold that had gripped the room was gone, replaced by a warm, comforting presence. I looked down at my arm. The mark was still there, but it was different now, faded, no longer burning with the same intensity. I could feel that the connection had been severed, that the spirit's hold on me was broken. I collapsed onto the floor, the knife slipping from my hand. The exhaustion that had been building up for days finally caught up with me, and I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. It was over. The spirit was gone, and I was free. Or at least I hoped I was. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I cleaned up the ritual items, making sure to dispose of them exactly as the book instructed. I didn't want to take any chances. Then I bandaged my arm and collapsed into bed, finally allowing myself to sleep. The nightmares didn't come that night. For the first time in what felt like forever, I slept peacefully, undisturbed by the cold, unblinking eyes that had haunted me for so long. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was check the mark on my arm. It was still there, a faint reminder of what I had been through, but it no longer held any power over me. The connection was gone, and I could finally move on with my life. But as I got up and started my day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It was a subtle shift, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The air in my apartment felt lighter, the shadows less oppressive. The presence that had lingered around me for days was gone, but in its place was a quiet, lingering unease. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was still on edge after everything that had happened. But as the day went on, that feeling of unease grew stronger. It wasn't fear, exactly, but more like an instinct, a sense that something wasn't quite right. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fact that the spirit was gone, that I was finally free. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ritual had changed something I couldn't yet understand. And as night fell once again, I found myself glancing at the shadows, wondering if I was truly alone. The days that followed were a mix of relief and uncertainty. I was free from the immediate threat, or so it seemed, but something lingered. A faint, nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. It wasn't the same as before. The cold spots, the whispers, the shadows creeping at the edge of my vision were gone. But in their place was a different kind of unease, like an itch I couldn't scratch, a thought I couldn't quite pin down. I went back to my usual routine, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy. I went to work, met up with friends, and even managed to get some sleep without being haunted by nightmares. But the mark on my arm, though faded, was still there, a constant reminder of what I had been through. I told myself that it was over, that the ritual had worked, and that whatever connection the spirit had to me was severed. But the feeling that something wasn't right never left. A week after the ritual, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "Are you sure it's over?" My heart skipped a beat as I clicked on it, half expecting another message from Moriarty or some other ominous figure from the dark web. But the email was short, just a single line. "Some bonds are harder to break than you think." Attached was a photograph of the house, the same house where this nightmare had begun. The image was dark, the house barely visible through the overgrown trees. But there was something else in the photo, something that sent a chill down my spine. In one of the upstairs windows, just barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. It was too faint to make out clearly, but the shape, the presence was unmistakable. The man with the empty eyes was still there, watching, waiting. I deleted the email immediately, my hands shaking. I tried to convince myself it was a trick, a prank, maybe someone trying to mess with me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The connection might have been severed, but it wasn't completely gone. There was still something tying me to that house, to that spirit, and it was stronger than I'd realized. The thought of going back to the house terrified me, but I knew I couldn't ignore this. I had to face it, once and for all, to ensure that the bond was truly broken. So with a heavy heart, I made the decision to return to where it all started. The drive to the house felt longer this time, the roads darker, the trees more menacing. The sun had set by the time I arrived, the sky a deep inky black with no moon to light the way. The house loomed ahead, just as decrepit and unsettling as I remembered. The sight of it made my stomach turn, but I forced myself to park the car and step out. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air grew colder, just as it had the first time. The house seemed to recognize me, like it had been waiting for my return. I hesitated, my breath visible in the frigid air, but I knew there was no turning back. I had to see this through. I made my way through the house, the floorboards creaking under my weight, the shadows seeming to close in around me. The layout was just as disorienting as before, the hallways twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. But I kept moving forward, drawn to the same room where I'd first encountered the spirit. When I reached the door, it was already open, as if inviting me in. The room looked exactly the same, walls covered in those strange symbols, the chair in the center, and the air heavy with an unseen presence. But this time there was no man standing in the shadows, no figure waiting to pounce. The room was empty. I stepped inside, the silence pressing in on me. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but the absence of the spirit was almost more unnerving than its presence had been. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. A cold breeze, faint but unmistakable, brushed against my arm, right where the mark was. I looked down, and to my horror, the mark was glowing faintly, pulsing with a soft, eerie light. Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. The temperature plummeted, the cold seeping into my bones, and I felt it again. The presence, the spirit, wrapping itself around me like a shroud. But this time, it didn't attack. It didn't try to pull me into the darkness. Instead, it whispered, "You're not done yet." The voice was low, barely audible, but it sent a chill through me. I could feel the spirit's frustration, its anger, but there was something else too, something almost desperate. It wasn't trying to harm me. It was trying to communicate, to tell me something I hadn't understood before. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why won't you let me go?" The air around me seemed to ripple, the shadows shifting and twisting as the spirit struggled to convey its message. And then, in a flash, it came to me. Not in words, but in images and feelings. The house, the spirit, the mark. It wasn't about me. It never had been. I was just a vessel, a conduit for something much older, much darker. The spirit wasn't trying to possess me. It was trying to break free, to escape the prison it had been trapped in for centuries. And the ritual I had performed, it hadn't severed the connection. It had only strengthened it, binding the spirit even more tightly to me. The email, the photograph, the lingering unease. I was the key to the spirit's freedom, and it needed me to finish what I had started. But I didn't know how. I didn't know what to do. The spirit's presence grew stronger, more insistent, pushing against the boundaries of the room, of the house, of me. I could feel it trying to merge with me, to guide me. But it was too much, too overwhelming. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The cold receded, the shadows stilled, and the room fell silent once more. The mark on my arm faded back to its usual dull color, no longer glowing, no longer pulsing. The spirit had withdrawn, its message delivered, but its fate still undecided. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The house was no longer just a haunted place, it was a prison, and I had been the unwitting jailer. The spirit's freedom depended on me, on my ability to finish what I had started. But I didn't know how. All I could do was leave, hoping that one day I would find the answers I needed. As I walked back to my car, the weight of the situation pressed down on me, but the fear that had once consumed me was gone. In its place was a quiet determination, a resolve to find a way to break the cycle, to free both myself and the spirit. The drive home was quiet, the roads empty, the night calm. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace, even if it was fleeting. The spirit was still with me, but it was no longer an enemy. It was a part of me now, a shadow that would follow me until I could find a way to set it free. And as I stepped into my apartment, the mark on my arm no longer burned. It was just a scar now, a reminder of a journey that was far from over. I didn't know when or how I would find the answers, but I knew one thing for certain. Some bonds are harder to break than you think. And my story is just beginning.